"I'm taking my mistress instead," Richard said, as if he were choosing a different wine for dinner. And by the time he finished his sentence, I already knew I wasn't the one being replaced. I was the one being erased. And what he didn't know was that I had already started planning the moment I would disappear on my own terms. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of our living room, casting long, quiet shadows across the hardwood floors I had polished myself every Sunday for the past 32 years. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could feel so final, how a single sentence could turn a home into a place I no longer recognized. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even ask him to repeat himself. I simply looked at him the way you look at someone you've just met, trying to understand who they really are. Because the man standing in front of me was not the one who had once held my hand in a small church in Ohio and promised to build a life together. He was someone colder, someone who spoke in decisions already made. He avoided my eyes as he adjusted his cufflinks, a small habit I had once found endearing, and behind him, sitting too comfortably on my cream-colored sofa, was Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, her posture relaxed, her smile carefully neutral, as if she were a guest waiting for the right moment to reveal she had always belonged there. The room felt smaller with the three of us in it, heavier, as though the walls themselves were listening, and I could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace, steady and indifferent, marking the seconds of a life that had just quietly shifted without permission. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling and let the silence stretch just long enough to make them wonder if I had understood. And then I gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The way you acknowledge bad weather before deciding whether to step outside. "I see," I said, my voice calm, almost detached, and that seemed to unsettle him more than any anger could have, because he shifted his weight, glanced briefly at Vanessa, and then back at me as if he had expected tears or pleading, or at the very least, resistance. But I had none to give him, not anymore, because something inside me had already gone still, not broken, just still, like a lake before a storm you can't yet see. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse, the same pale blue one he used to say brought out my eyes, and I walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where I had planted roses one spring decades ago, each bush carefully spaced, each color chosen with intention, and I thought about how long it had taken for them to grow, how quietly they had flourished when no one was watching. Behind me, I could hear Vanessa's soft voice, low and measured, asking something I couldn't quite make out, and Richard's response, shorter, sharper, the kind of tone he used when he wanted control of a situation he was no longer certain he understood. I didn't turn around, because I didn't need to see them to know exactly what was happening. The pieces had already begun to fit together in my mind. Small moments I had ignored, late nights explained too quickly, glances that lingered just a second too long, and suddenly, it all felt less like a shock and more like a pattern I had finally decided to recognize. "We'll need to talk about the house," Richard said eventually, his voice steadier now, rehearsed, and that was when I allowed myself the smallest of smiles, one he couldn't see reflected in the glass, because that was the moment I understood something. He didn't. That he believed the house was still part of his plan, that it was something he could simply take along with everything else he had decided to replace, and I let that belief sit between us, untouched, because correcting him too soon would have ruined everything. I turned back to face them, my expression composed, my voice even, and I said, "Of course," as if there were nothing unusual about the conversation we were having, as if the ground beneath us hadn't already shifted beyond repair. And in that moment, while they were both watching me, trying to measure what I might do next, I made a decision so quietly, so completely, that neither of them noticed it at all, not then, not even close, because by the time they would understand it, by the time they would come back expecting to claim what they thought was theirs, there would be nothing left for them to take. The house felt different that evening, not because anything had physically changed, but because I had stopped seeing it as ours and started seeing it as something that needed to be handled carefully, deliberately, like a fragile object that could either be preserved or quietly transferred before anyone noticed it was gone. I moved through each room slowly, not out of nostalgia, but out of calculation, noting what mattered, what could be documented, what needed to be done first, and what could wait. And for the first time in years, I was not reacting to my life. I was directing it. Richard had always believed I handled the small things, the groceries, the bills, the maintenance calls, the endless details that kept everything running smoothly, and he had been right. But what he never understood was that those small things were the foundation of everything else, including the things he thought belonged to him. I opened the drawer in the study where we kept important documents, the same drawer I had organized every spring, and I ran my fingers over the neatly labeled folders, mortgage statements, tax returns, insurance policies, each one a quiet record of years of responsibility that he had long ago stopped paying attention to. And I pulled out the property file with a steady hand, setting it on the desk as the late afternoon sun stretched across the surface. I did not rush, because rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes leave traces, and I had no intention of leaving anything behind that could be questioned later. Instead, I made a list in my mind, simple, clear, practical: contact the attorney I trusted, review the ownership structure, confirm what had already been placed in my name over the years. And there was more than Richard remembered, far more than he had ever bothered to track, because convenience had always been easier than control for him. Downstairs, I could hear the faint murmur of voices, his and Vanessa's, blending together in a low, private rhythm that told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been unfolding, how comfortable they had become in their assumptions, and how certain they were that I would simply step aside when the time came. I closed the drawer quietly and carried the folder with me into the kitchen, setting it beside the sink where I had once stood preparing meals for holidays, birthdays, ordinary Sundays that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. And I allowed myself one brief pause, not to mourn, but to acknowledge that I had given more than they would ever understand, and that I would not give anything more. When Richard finally walked in, he leaned against the counter as if nothing had changed, as if we were discussing a minor adjustment rather than the dismantling of a life. And he began outlining what he called practical next steps, timelines, arrangements, words that sounded organized but carried no real understanding of the ground he was standing on, and I listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, letting him believe he was still leading the conversation. Vanessa stood slightly behind him, her eyes moving between us, watching, measuring, perhaps waiting for a reaction she could interpret, but I gave her nothing, not confusion, not anger, not even curiosity, just a calm attention that revealed nothing and promised even less. "We should move quickly," Richard said, his tone firm, as if urgency belonged to him, and I met his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to feel seen, but not understood, and then I said, "You are right, we should not delay," and I meant every word, just not in the way he thought. Later that night, after they had both left the room, after the house settled into its familiar quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of me, the papers aligned neatly, and I reached for the phone, dialing a number I had not needed in years but had never forgotten, because some preparations are made long before they are ever used. And when the voice on the other end answered, steady and professional, I introduced myself without hesitation, because the moment had arrived exactly as I had anticipated, and this time, I was the one deciding what would happen next. The next morning began like any other, which was exactly what I needed, because normal routines make people careless, and careless people do not notice when something important begins to shift beneath them. I woke up at 6, made my coffee the same way I always had, 2 spoons of ground beans, 8 ounces of water, no sugar, no rush, and I sat by the window watching the early light settle over the backyard. The same roses still standing where I had planted them years ago, steady and quiet, just like I intended to be. At 9 sharp, I walked into the office of Andrew Collins, the attorney who had handled several matters for me over the years, and when he looked up and saw me, there was a brief flicker of recognition followed by something else, something more attentive, because people like Andrew notice when a person walks in with a different kind of silence. I explained everything without drama, without exaggeration, just facts, clear and precise, and I watched his expression shift from polite professionalism to focused concern as he reviewed the documents I had brought, his fingers moving carefully across each page, his questions direct, his tone measured, and when he finally leaned back in his chair, he did not ask whether I was sure. He simply asked how quickly I wanted to move. I told him there was no reason to wait, because waiting only benefits the people who believe they are already ahead. And he nodded as if he had heard that answer before, though perhaps not delivered quite this way. We discussed ownership, timelines, options, and what mattered most was something Richard had overlooked entirely. The house had been structured in a way that gave me far more authority than he remembered. Details he had dismissed years ago as minor legal formalities now standing quietly in my favor, and Andrew outlined the steps with calm efficiency, listing what needed to be signed, what needed to be filed, and how quickly a sale could be arranged under the right conditions. I left his office with a folder that felt heavier than the one I had carried in, not because of the papers, but because of the certainty it represented, and as I stepped outside, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as if something that had been blurred for a long time had finally come into focus. When I returned home, the house was empty, which was convenient, because silence allows work to be done without interruption, and I moved through each room again, this time with purpose, making quiet notes, taking photographs, preparing the information that would be needed. And I noticed details I had not paid attention to in years, the way the light fell in, the late morning across the living room floor, the faint creak in the third stair from the bottom, the small imperfections that make a place real rather than perfect. And I realized that none of those things would belong to Richard anymore, no matter what he believed. That evening, when he called, his voice carried a casual confidence, the kind that comes from assuming the outcome has already been decided, and he spoke about schedules, about when he and Vanessa would return, about what would need to be arranged next, and I listened, answering simply, agreeing where it made sense, offering nothing that would disturb his expectations, because expectations are useful when they are wrong. After the call ended, I placed the phone down gently and looked around the room one more time, not with attachment, but with clarity, because the decision had already been made. The process had already begun, and by the time Richard stepped back through that front door believing he was coming home to claim something that still belonged to him, there would be nothing left waiting for him except the realization that he had misunderstood everything from the very beginning. The following days unfolded with a quiet precision that would have seemed ordinary to anyone watching from the outside, but every action I took carried intention. Every step aligned with a plan that was already moving forward whether Richard understood it or not. Andrew called me just before noon on Tuesday, his voice calm and efficient as he confirmed that the initial paperwork had been reviewed and that we could proceed with listing the house immediately under a private arrangement. 1. Designed to move quickly without drawing unnecessary attention, and I agreed without hesitation because speed, in this case, was not urgency but strategy. I spent that afternoon preparing the house in a way I never had before, not for guests, not for family, but for a transaction, removing anything that felt too personal, too specific, anything that might anchor me emotionally to a place I had already decided to leave behind. And as I worked, I noticed how easily the rooms transformed, how quickly a home could become just a structure when you stopped attaching meaning to it. The photographs came down first. Frames I had dusted for years now placed carefully into boxes, each image a record of moments that no longer belonged to the life unfolding now, and I did not linger over them, because looking back was not part of what needed to happen next. By Wednesday morning, the house looked different, cleaner, more neutral, as if it were already preparing to belong to someone else, and when the realtor arrived, she walked through each room with a professional eye, making notes, asking questions, her tone respectful but focused, and she did not ask why I was selling so suddenly, because people in her line of work understand that timing often speaks for itself. She mentioned that the market was strong, that properties like this, well maintained and in a desirable neighborhood, could move within days under the right conditions, and I simply nodded, because I had no interest in waiting weeks for a process that needed to be finished before Richard returned. Later that afternoon, I received a message from him, brief and casual, saying that he and Vanessa would be extending their trip by a couple of days, something about needing more time away, and I read it twice, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed exactly what I needed: time, space, and their complete absence from anything that was about to happen. I replied with a simple acknowledgement, nothing more, because the less I said, the more he would assume everything was proceeding according to his expectations, and assumptions, when left unchallenged, tend to grow stronger on their own. By Thursday, the first offer came in, followed quickly by another, both competitive, both serious, and Andrew reviewed them with me over the phone, outlining the advantages of each. But in the end, the decision was not complicated. I chose the one that guaranteed the fastest closing, the cleanest terms, the least opportunity for delay, and when I signed the preliminary agreement, I did so with a steady hand, aware that this was the moment the plan shifted from preparation to execution. That evening, I walked through the house one last time, not to say goodbye, but to confirm that everything was in place, every detail aligned, every step accounted for. And as I turned off the lights in each room, I felt no hesitation, no second thoughts, only a quiet certainty that what I was doing was not a reaction to betrayal, but a decision to step out of it entirely. And by the time Richard and Vanessa would return expecting to continue a story they believed they controlled, they would find that the ending had already been written without them. By Friday morning, everything was no longer theoretical. It was in motion, signed, scheduled, and moving forward with a quiet certainty that did not require announcement. And when Andrew called to confirm the closing date had been fast-tracked, I simply thanked him and noted the time, because this was never about celebration, it was about completion. The buyer had agreed to all terms without hesitation, a clean offer, no contingencies that could delay the process, and that alone told me something important. They saw the value in what Richard had taken for granted, and they were ready to move as quickly as I was. I spent the next hours not rushing, but finishing, moving through the house with a calm efficiency, sorting what I would take, what I would leave, and what no longer mattered enough to decide about, because when a chapter closes this completely, the details lose their weight. I packed only what I needed, documents, a few personal items, clothing that fit into 2 suitcases, nothing excessive, nothing that tied me to the past more than necessary. And with each item placed carefully inside, I felt the space around me grow lighter, not empty, but free of obligation. The closing itself was scheduled for early afternoon, a quiet office, neutral walls, a polished table that had seen countless transactions before mine, and I sat across from Andrew as he guided me through each document, each signature deliberate, each page turning with a soft, steady rhythm that marked the end of something far more significant than a property exchange. No one raised their voice, no one questioned the process. It was efficient, professional, and entirely final. And when the last paper was signed, Andrew looked at me for a brief moment, not with sympathy, but with recognition, as if he understood that this had never been about the house alone. The funds were transferred within the hour, confirmed with a simple notification on my phone, numbers replacing something that had once been physical, tangible, familiar, and I watched the screen for a moment longer than necessary, not because I doubted it, but because it represented the point of no return. When I stepped out of the building, the afternoon air felt warmer than it had in days, or perhaps I was simply more aware of it, and I walked to my car without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that needed one last glance. Later, I returned to the house one final time, not as an owner, but as someone completing a task, and I moved through each room with purpose, checking that everything was in order, that nothing had been overlooked. And when I reached the front door, I paused just long enough to turn off the last light, the small click echoing briefly in the quiet space. I placed the keys on the kitchen counter exactly where the realtor had instructed, a simple gesture, almost insignificant, yet it carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. My phone buzzed as I stepped outside, a message from Richard, casual, almost impatient, asking when I would be ready to discuss the next steps, and I read it without reacting, because he was still speaking as though the ground had not shifted beneath him, as though the decisions he had made were still in effect, and I slipped the phone back into my bag without replying, because some answers are better delivered in absence rather than words. And as I drove away, leaving the driveway empty for the first time in decades, I knew that by the time he returned, expecting to walk through that front door and find everything exactly where he had left it, he would instead be standing in front of something he no longer owned, something that no longer belonged to either of us. And for the first time since he spoke those words, I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not of relief, but of completion. I did not go back to the house after that, not even out of habit, because returning would have suggested there was something left to revisit, and there was not. Everything that needed to be finished had already been completed with a level of precision that left no loose ends behind. Instead, I checked into a small extended stay hotel on the other side of town, the kind of place designed for transition rather than permanence, where the furniture was neutral, the walls undecorated, and no one asked questions about how long you planned to stay. And for the first time in many years, I found myself in a space that carried no expectations, no history, and no obligation to explain anything to anyone. That evening, I unpacked only what I needed, placing my documents in the drawer beside the bed, hanging a few pieces of clothing in the closet, leaving the rest of the suitcase closed. Because this was not about settling in. It was about moving forward. My phone remained silent for most of the night, which did not surprise me, because Richard had always assumed that time moved according to his schedule, not realizing that while he was away extending his plans, I had already rewritten mine. The next morning, the calls began, first one, then another, each spaced just far enough apart to suggest growing impatience rather than immediate alarm, and I watched the screen light up with his name before letting it go dark again. Because there are moments when answering too soon weakens the message that silence is meant to deliver. By mid-afternoon, a message appeared, longer this time, asking where I was, why I had not responded, and when we would be meeting to finalize what he still believed were shared decisions, and I read every word. Carefully, not for information, but for tone, because tone reveals what facts often try to conceal, and what I heard in his words was not concern, but expectation. I set the phone down and walked to the window, looking out over the parking lot where cars came and went without notice, each person moving through their own separate story. And I realized how simple it is to step out of a life once you understand that it was never built on the foundation you believed it was. Late in the afternoon, Andrew called again, confirming that the final recording had been completed, that everything had been processed through the county office, and that as of that moment, the property was no longer in my name, and certainly not in Richard's, and I thanked him for his work, not with emotion, but with clarity, because gratitude, like everything else, feels different when it is no longer tied to loss. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the buildings and the light softened across the room, my phone rang again, this time with a different urgency, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of control, and when I finally lifted it to my ear, I did not speak first, because silence, when used correctly, invites the other person to reveal more than they intended. His voice came quickly, sharper now, asking questions that no longer carried confidence, and I listened, not interrupting, allowing each word to settle between us, because the moment he had been expecting was finally beginning to arrive, just not in the way he had planned. And as I stood there, calm and steady, in a room that held none of my past but all of my decisions, I understood that what came next would not require explanation, only timing, and I had already chosen exactly when that timing would be. He did not try to hide it anymore after that. The confusion in his voice had sharpened into something closer to panic, and I could hear it in the way he spoke my name, no longer casually, but with a kind of urgency that had not existed before, as if saying it louder or faster might somehow restore control he had already lost. "Margaret, where are you?" he asked, his words overlapping slightly, his usual composure slipping just enough to reveal what sat beneath it. And I let a brief silence settle before answering, not because I did not know what to say, but because timing matters more than words in moments like this. "I am exactly where I need to be," I said, my voice even, steady, giving him nothing to hold on to, and I could almost picture the way he would pause, trying to interpret what that meant, searching for the familiar patterns that no longer applied. There was a sound behind him, faint but recognizable, the echo of a space that was not home, and then Vanessa's voice, quieter, asking something I could not quite make out, and that was when I understood they had already arrived, already standing somewhere near what used to belong to them, already beginning to realize that something was wrong. "We are at the house," he said finally, and there was a slight shift in his tone, something tighter, more controlled, as if he were trying to regain his footing. "And there is a problem," and I allowed myself the smallest pause, just enough for the words to settle fully on both sides of the line. "There is no problem," I replied. "There is only information you have not yet accepted." And this time the silence that followed was heavier, because he could hear the certainty in my voice, the absence of doubt, the complete lack of negotiation. He started asking questions then, faster now, each one more direct than the last, about the realtor sign, about the empty rooms, about the keys that were no longer where he expected them to be, and I listened to every word without interrupting, because the realization needed to come from him, not from me. "You sold it?" he finally asked, the words coming out slower, as if saying them too quickly might make them less real, and I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of emotion, but out of acknowledgement, because this was the moment everything aligned exactly as it was meant to. "Yes," I said, simply, without emphasis, without explanation, just a fact delivered as calmly as it had been executed. And on the other end of the line, the silence changed again, no longer confusion, but something heavier, something that could not be undone. Vanessa's voice rose slightly in the background, sharper now, demanding details, asking questions he could not answer, and I imagined the way she would be looking around, noticing what was missing, what had been taken down, what had been cleared away long before they ever thought to question it. "You had no right," Richard said then, his voice lower, controlled in a different way now, and I let that sentence sit between us for a moment before responding, because it revealed more about his assumptions than anything else he had said. "I had every right," I answered, not with anger, but with clarity, because the difference between what he believed and what was true had always been there. He had simply never taken the time to see it. He began to argue, to list reasons, to reconstruct a version of reality that placed him back in control, but none of it held. Not against documents that had already been signed, transactions that had already been completed, decisions that had already been finalized, and I did not interrupt him, because sometimes the most effective response is allowing someone to hear themselves reach the end of an argument that no longer applies. When he finally stopped, there was nothing left in his voice but the absence of certainty, and that was when I spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer than before. "You made your decision, Richard, and I made mine." And I let the words rest there, complete, because there was nothing else that needed to be added, nothing that needed to be explained. The outcome had already been delivered long before this conversation ever began. The line remained quiet after my last sentence, but it was not the kind of silence that brings peace. It was the kind that forces someone to confront something they had not prepared for, and I could almost hear the shift happening on the other end, the slow realization settling in as the pieces began to connect in a way that no longer favored him. "Margaret," he said again, this time slower, more measured, as if choosing each word carefully might restore some kind of balance. "You cannot just walk away like this." And I let out a small breath, not in frustration, but in recognition of how deeply he still misunderstood what had already taken place. "I already have," I replied, my voice calm, steady, without any need to raise it, because truth does not require volume to be heard. There was movement in the background, the faint echo of footsteps on an empty floor, the hollow sound of a space that no longer held what they expected, and then Vanessa's voice, sharper now, cutting through whatever control he was trying to maintain, asking questions that were no longer directed at me, but at him, questions about how this could have happened, about what he had assumed, about what he had failed to secure, and I listened without interruption, because this was no longer my conversation to manage. "Where are we supposed to go?" he asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could reshape it into something more controlled. And that was when I understood that the certainty he once carried had been replaced by something far less stable, something uncertain and unfamiliar, and I did not rush to answer, because some questions are not meant to be solved in the moment they are asked. "That is something you should have considered earlier," I said quietly, not as a reprimand, but as a statement of fact, because the decisions that led to this moment had not been mine alone. They had been shaped long before I chose to act. He began to speak again, attempting to reframe the situation, to suggest alternatives, to imply that there were still discussions to be had, but each word felt less grounded than the last, as if he were reaching for something that no longer existed, and I allowed him to continue just long enough to understand that there was nothing left for me to respond to. "There is nothing more to discuss," I said finally, not cutting him off, but closing the space between what had been and what was now finished. And the simplicity of that sentence seemed to settle more heavily than anything else I had said. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and in that pause, I realized how different the silence felt compared to before. It was no longer filled with unspoken expectations or unresolved tension. It was clear, defined, complete. I moved toward the window again, watching the evening light fade across the parking lot. The steady rhythm of people coming and going without any awareness of the shift that had just taken place in my life. And there was something grounding in that, something that reminded me that the world does not pause for personal endings. It simply continues, and we decide whether to follow it forward or remain where we have been. "Margaret," he said one last time, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty it once carried. And I did not respond immediately, not because I needed time, but because I no longer felt the need to fill every silence. And when I finally spoke, my words were simple, final, and entirely my own. "Take care of yourself." And with that, I ended the call, not abruptly, not with force, but with the same calm precision that had guided every decision I had made since the moment everything changed. And as I set the phone down beside me, I understood that what had once been a life defined by shared space and shared decisions had now become something else entirely, something quieter, something clearer, something that no longer required me to stay where I was not valued. And for the first time in a long time, the silence around me did not feel empty, it felt complete. The next morning arrived without urgency, without noise, just a quiet continuation of something that no longer needed to be questioned. And I woke up before the alarm, not out of habit, but because there was nothing left pressing on my mind, nothing unresolved waiting for attention, only the steady awareness that everything had already been set in motion and completed exactly as it needed to be. I made my coffee the same way I always had, measuring carefully, pouring slowly, allowing the routine to unfold without interruption. And as I sat by the window again, watching the early light settle across a place that was not yet mine, but already felt like a beginning, I realized that familiarity does not come from walls or furniture. It comes from the absence of tension, from the quiet space where you are no longer waiting for something to go wrong. My phone remained still on the table beside me, no messages, no missed calls, and I did not check it, because there was nothing left that required my attention, nothing that needed to be answered. And for the first time in years, silence did not feel like avoidance. It felt like clarity. Later that day, I met with Andrew once more, not to revisit the past, but to finalize the last administrative details, simple confirmations, updated records, the kind of tasks that bring closure not through emotion, but through completion. And when he handed me the final set of documents, neatly organized, clearly labeled, I accepted them with a small nod, not as a reminder of what had ended, but as proof of what had been secured. "Everything is in order," he said, his tone professional, but with a subtle note of respect that had not been there before, and I thanked him, because he had done exactly what was required, nothing more, nothing less, and sometimes that is all that matters. When I stepped outside, the day felt open, unstructured, and I took a longer route back, not because I needed to, but because I could. And that simple shift, the ability to choose direction without explanation, carried more weight than I had expected. As the hours passed, I found myself considering what came next, not in terms of rebuilding what had been lost, but in defining something entirely new, something that did not rely on shared expectations or unspoken compromises, something that existed on its own terms. I did not rush to make decisions. I did not fill the time with distractions. I allowed the space to remain open, because not every silence needs to be replaced. Some silences are where understanding takes shape. That evening, as the sun lowered once more and the light softened across the room, I placed the documents into the drawer beside the bed, not as something to revisit, but as something that had already served its purpose. And I stood there for a moment, looking around at a life that was no longer defined by what had been taken, but by what had been chosen. There were no dramatic endings, no final confrontations, no need for anything more than what had already been said and done, because the truth had settled into place without resistance, clear and undeniable. And as I turned off the light and prepared for the night, I understood something that had taken years to fully see, that leaving is not always an act of loss. Sometimes it is the most precise form of control. And as I lay there in the quiet, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to reclaim, I allowed myself one final thought, steady and certain. They believed they were replacing me, But in the end, they only revealed how easily everything they depended on could disappear without them even noticing until it was already gone.